Welcome to the Imaginative Storm podcast. I'm your host, jamesnave. This week we have poet Nickole Brown as our guest. I've known Nickole for many years. She and I went to Vermont College together, and she lives now in Asheville. Nickole is an accomplished poet with many books to her credit, essays, articles, editorial work. I think you will enjoy her take on poetry. I recorded this about 4 years ago at Nickole's house in Asheville, so it will reflect a pre-pandemic mindset, which may be interesting now that we're cycling out of the pandemic intensity and learning to live with COVID-19, which is indeed still around. And before we turn to Nickole's conversation, please remember to join us every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, noon Eastern Time for our Imaginative Storm Writing Prompt of the Week session/workshop. It's always free, and the Zoom link is at imaginativestorm.com. And my email, if you have any questions, nave@imaginativestorm.com. And thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song, walterparks.com. So now let's turn to the conversation with Nickole, and I simply asked her to talk about what it was like when she first started to become aware of poetry. So here's Nickole Brown.
So I didn't exactly grow up with poetry by any means. I was raised on the literary equivalent of grease and plastic. My family, we didn't have a whole lot of books in the house. We had the Bible, and we had Cosmo magazine, and I got into some trouble for copying and pasting one into the other, which my grandmother really gave me a what for that one. I didn't encounter poetry until I was about 15 years old, when I went to a program in Kentucky called Governor's School for the Arts. I won't go into how I got in there, because it was just there by the grace of God go I. But I did get in, and everything started to change for me. It was just a little 2-week program in which I was away from the house, and I was surrounded by young artists and writers and people who cared about arts and writing, and everything changed for me. I remember it was in downtown Louisville at the time, and a group of friends and I snuck to the rooftop of Spalding University, because the campus at the time was downtown, and we were reading Rilke. And the sun was going down in Louisville at the time, and we were looking out over the city, and we were reading these words, carried across the water all of those years, and everything changed. And I distinctly remember coming down the fire escape and thinking, this is who I am. This is what I want to be. And I was 15, and that was it.
So I want to go back to your first experience in revision, which of course was the magazine and the Bible. So I'm curious, did you cut the magazine up and put it in the Bible, or did you cut the Bible up and put it in the magazine? And which book did you work with in the Bible?
Oh, no, I'm not going into all of those details. I think that it might have... See, I'm feeling like I'm in trouble already. I feel like I'm in trouble already. I think that it would have been the book of Job, maybe? Yeah. I was little, Nave. I was really little, and I was putting magazine pictures into the Bible. Yeah.
So as you were talking about escaping from the roof of Spalding College, going down on the fire escape, I was thinking of the magazine and of the Bible, and thinking when one is bad, one descends into hell after death. And yet on the fire escape, in our culture, one actually escapes down the fire escape, away from the fire, to the safe earth.
Yeah. I think it was more, I remember the moment on the fire escape, and distinctly thinking, how can I hold on to this fire? I remember sitting there with my friends and feeling that thing that poetry can give you for the first time, where there's a shift, where things become new and strange, and you have this awareness, you have this veil pulled away from you. It was the first time I felt it, and I don't even think at the time I could have articulated what it was that I felt, but I remember coming down from the fire escape. I had friends below me and friends above me. We're all carefully making our way down from a place we really should not have been, and thinking, how can I get this to stay? How can I feel this way again? And I think most of my life from that moment has been a fight to get back to that rooftop, or to stay on that rooftop as long as I possibly could. I don't know if that makes any sense.
That feeling you had on the rooftop, you now connect to poetry. Mm-hmm. When you were on the rooftop and you had that feeling, were you aware then it was connected to poetry?
Yeah, I was, because I was surrounded by people for the first time who truly cared about words and story and art. We were young and vibrant, and of course, our own little haphazard version of Dead Poets Society, right? But there was this thing where you think the world is one way, and then there's a shift that happens, and you look out on the city, and it's the same city it was a moment before, but yet it is completely different, and it has been changed by the presence of awareness and art. You know how your life is almost a collage of all of these little moments, these little defining moment that absolutely change you and make you, and those are my deathbed stories, right? That's what makes me. That was one of those moments where I felt for the very first time what literally just sitting with a group of like-minded people reading poems aloud to one another, which is what we were doing, could change you.
That sense of transformation happened while you were reading poems. People in the audience may be thinking, I've had a similar sense and didn't think to call it a poetic sense. Yeah. Would you think it would be fair for them to call that same experience, maybe in a different context, poetic as well?
I think that people tap in all sorts of ways. I think that flow comes through running for some people, or yoga, or making furniture, or gardening, or whatever that thing is that brings you closest to who you are. I think it was, for me, the first time I slipped into my own shoes. So, yes, for me it was a poetic experience, because poetry then is how I move through the world, and it's what I do. It transferred me into the noun of myself, the thing of myself, into the verb of myself, what it is that I can do in the world. And it was like, oh, I have a voice. I have words. How then can I use these? Can I do this? It's when you become who you are. So yes, for me it was a very poetic experience, and if you transfer that word over to other people for however they achieve that thing, yeah, but it's not necessarily limited to any one given art or way of being. It's just when you become who you are.
So after you had the experience and descended the ladder, what did you do after that to engage that original impulse you had on the rooftop?
I worked. And when I think of my early years coming out of high school into undergrad, my early 20s, I had 3 jobs, I had 4 jobs, I had 6 jobs. I was going to college, I was pouring coffee, I was volunteering at arts centers, I was volunteering for reading centers. I was doing anything I could to move myself out of the role that was set for me in my family, which was a working class family in which the only expectation that was ever set out for me was to be a homemaker and a mother and a housewife, which is a wonderful, meaningful thing to be, but it wasn't who I was. So I had to break out of that. And it's funny because those rooftop moments, quote unquote, are few and far between, but it's such a strong drug that it carries you for months, sometimes years in between. You know, I had to, Rilke, speaking of Rilke, you must change your life. Right? Last word of that poem, the last line of that poem, you must change your life. I knew that I had to change who I was. I had to change my prescribed role. And so in order to do that, I had to get an education. I had to read. I had to save my money and learn. You know, and that's what I did.
So when you were inspired to take on this new role as a poet, did you think of yourself as brave and courageous, or simply moving forward in the direction of your destiny?
Both. Also felt of myself as foolish and stupid too, right? When you change yourself, when you step out of what those who love you want you to be, you doubt everything about yourself, right? What am I doing? Why am I moving in this direction? Who do I think I am? That's a good one, right? Especially for poetry, which is such a beautiful waste of time, right? It's such a useless thing in a world of necessary. But then again, there's nothing more useful or more necessary to me, you know, and the fight then to hold on to that. I mean, I think, Nave, that's something I've always admired about you. I was 19 when we met, and you, more than anyone, have always had this unabiding love for poetry and for art, no matter the cost. And there is a cost to it. There is a fight implied. It's so funny. I think that people outside of the poetry world think that I sit in a cafe in a pinstripe suit and sip cappuccinos and write poems all day. Or my mother, that long ago, because my wife and I moved to Asheville 2 years ago to write full time, and my mother told a cousin of mine not too long ago that I had retired to Asheville. You know, that I was in retirement. I was like, what? But it's work. It's absolute work. It's taken us several months just to find these few hours to sit down and talk.
And from a broad point of view, poetry is all about communication and language. So on one level, I understand the notion of the uselessness of it and the beautiful meaninglessness of just wallowing around in it. And yet, flip side of that, it's a deep look at language, how we communicate, how we create clarity for other people to absorb. So it becomes, with that perspective, dramatically useful and dramatically meaningful. And yet your mother would say, oh, my daughter retired to Asheville to gaze at the bluebirds.
I think so too. I mean, I think what I mean that is useless, unlike the kind of manual labor that literally moves a bale of hay from one side of the barn to the next, and unlike the kind of work that fixes something, that gets out a hammer and just puts it back together. Poetry is elusive. And when it's doing its job, when it's really doing its work, I'm not there to witness it. So someone might be listening to this radio interview months from now and might hear something that connects with them or moves them, but I don't know about it unless they, please, stop and write me. Let me know. Right? Oftentimes, your poems, your books, they go out into the world. They do their job. Because if you stick with a book long enough, it's like raising a child and then sending them out. And if they're doing well, you probably might not even hear from them anymore.
On that note of sending a poem out in the world, how about let's send one out right now? I know you have some of your work around you. I would love for you to pick out a piece to read for us.
Sure. What I'll do is I'll read a new poem for you. I have 2 books out into the world. The first book is called Sister, and it's primarily the story of growing up in Kentucky. They're epistolary poems addressed to my sister. The second book is called Fanny Says and is about my grandmother. Currently, I'm writing about animals. I'm particularly writing about animal sentience and the human-animal relationship, what animals we love, which ones we hate, which ones we eat, which ones we worship, on and on. So this first piece is a prayer to talk to animals. Lord, I ain't asking to be the beast master, Jim ripped in a jungle loincloth, or a Dr. Doolittle, or even the expensive vet down the street, that stethoscoped redhead, her diamond ring big as a Cracker Jack toy. All I want is for you to help me flip off this light box in its scroll of dread, to rip a tiny tear between this world and that. A slit in the veil, Lord, one of those old-fashioned peeping keyholes through which I can press my dumb lips and speak. If you will, Lord, make me the teeth hot in the mouth of a raccoon scraping the junk I scraped from last night's plates. Make me the blue eye of that young crow cocked to me, too selfish to even look up from the flash of my phone. Oh, forgive me, Lord, how human I've become. Busy clicking what I like, busy pushing my cuticles back and back to expose all 10 pale, useless moons. Would you let me tell your creatures how sorry I am? Let them know exactly what we've done. Am I not an animal too? If so, Lord, make me one again. Give me back my dirty claws and blood-warm horns. Braid back those long, frayed strands of every nerve tingling with all I thought I had to do today. Fork my tongue, Lord. There is a sorrow on the air I taste, but cannot name. I want to open my mouth and know the exact flavor of what's to come. I want to open my mouth and sound a language that calls all language home.
A language that calls all language home. Open my mouth and sound a language that calls all language home. Why are you so interested in the language of animals?
I think I'm interested in language, period. I think I have always been obsessed with language. Growing up where I did, my accent was thick and very Southern, and I learned very soon that I had to learn how to code switch, to speak quote-unquote standard English, to move into the world and to teach and to read and to speak and be taken seriously. And now, moving forward, I'm interested in the language of other living things, of non-human things. I'm interested to know how they speak to one another and perhaps what they might be saying to us but we can't possibly hear, or what we can say to them that perhaps they don't understand. For a long time, humans have considered themselves quite separate from the rest of creation, either through the idea of dominion or the feeling of fear. And I think that paradigm has to shift. We are not so different from anything else. The idea of communication, the idea of connectivity with other living things is perhaps the only thing that might save us. We are at the mercy right now of a world that we have created. A world that we didn't create this world. We live in this world and we have damaged this world. Do you know what I'm saying? Climate change is here and is happening and is coming. Ecological devastation is here and is happening, and more will come. And that we have to start communicating. We have to start paying attention to other living things around us.
I agree. And we see the changes all the time. In your own home, you have a couple of dogs.
Yeah.
You love your dogs. You take them wherever you go. A lot of people also have dogs, so this question will be a familiar question almost anybody could answer if they've owned a dog. Everybody who's ever owned a dog, myself included, will claim, and as I do, I can talk to my dog and my dog understands me. And yet we're not speaking the same language. So how do we know the dogs actually understand us? Because if you are saying, as you are, we need to learn how to understand what the animals are saying, and maybe they will understand what we're saying. I think you and your dogs maybe understand each other. Reflect on that a little bit.
I think what you're getting into is a tricky question. I'm much more interested in my dog understand me. I think that my dog, both of my dogs for that matter, are blessed with senses and awarenesses that I don't have, that I have, quote unquote, evolved out of. What they can smell, what they can hear, their closeness to the earth, their perception of time, and their absolute joy. I think anyone who has a dog, one of the things that they love is when they come home, and no matter how worn out they are, no matter how ugly they might be that day, their dog is happy to see them. And what allows for that exuberance? What allows for that present momentness of a dog? I'm much more interested in understanding the dog. I think that Solace, my little puppy, my golden retriever puppy, who's a year and a half now, she's understanding most of what I'm asking her to do, to sit or stay or, sometimes, right? But I'm mesmerized by her. And how then she moves through the world, and then how then when I do need to talk to her, how then I can communicate with her. I'm also volunteering at a farm sanctuary not too far from here called Animal Haven. And there we have rescued sheep and goats and unwanted chickens that no longer lay eggs. Some of the hens, or actually one hen in particular, who actually crows like a rooster and is no longer allowed in the city anymore. Ducks and geese and pigs that grew to the size of refrigerators that people thought would be the size of a puppy. I love being among them. I love the bodiness of being around them. I love that for the vast majority of the week, it's me in front of my computer screen, shifting words around, worrying about this thing or the other. But when I'm at Animal Haven, when I'm working, I'm in the muck and I'm in my body and I get to be with those animals, and it's changed me. Yeah.
How about another animal poem, since we're with animals?
Sure. Okay, sure. So what I'd like to read is a longer poem, and it's something that I wrote for Trina and Barb, which are the two women that run Animal Haven Farm Sanctuary. And the thing that you need to understand about this poem is that I wrote it shortly after the election, and I was thinking about what was ahead, and I, like a lot of people, felt kind of desperate. Fortunately enough, I could put on my muck boots and go to the farm, and sure enough, when I arrived there and I walked into the barn, the animals were just happy to see me. They were just hungry. And I began to think about that. At the same time, I started reading Rebecca Solnit. She has a book called Hope in the Dark. And one of the ideas put forth in her book that absolutely changed me was that hope, the idea of hope, is not something you necessarily feel. It's something that you do. the same way that courage isn't necessarily what you feel when you act courageous. You feel fear, but you act courageous. And hope then can be something that you do when you feel hopeless. So this then is called Against Despair, the Kid Goat. Reader, meet the two women who sunk everything they had into taking in broken animals. The gimpy and oozing critters, the ugly, lopsided, tailless pets, urine-soaked and drooling, zested with fleas, the matted and discarded scrap heaps left growling and bucking, pissing on everything, the good riddance left roped to a chain-link fence. No, I take that back. Instead, I want you to be them. I want you crazy enough to try to fix them, to feed and brush and bathe and dip and sweet milk those beasts whole. I want you to try, to always try, despite the odds, just as you coax the docile, fat, blind pig up on legs that eventually broke from his own inbred weight. Just as you spritz the mites off a mangy hen that would be limp in the claws of a hawk later that same day. On the hill, a stubborn but sometimes gentle sheep grows cold under a blue tarp, and in your truck is a towel across the back seat for your favorite but neurotic as hell dog. How you rushed her to the vet only to see her put down. No, let me make this real. Reader, I want you tired, every joint in your body stiff and worn. I want you to finally strip off your filthy clothes. Then I want you jolted from sleep by a cry that in your dreams sounds like an infant wailing, and now awake sounds just the same. Now, find that kid goat bleeding in the grainy dark. He's no bigger than a lap dog, and on his fist-sized head are the buds of his horns, tiny, like 2 popcorn pieces of warm bone. 2 bright spots, the only thing you can see. Flip on the switch. Now you know. With bare hands, I want you to clear the froth from his lolling tongue. I want you to grab a rag, a sponge, the corner of your shirt, anything you can find to sop up the liquid, so much of it you can't tell what's what, be it mucus or bile or vomit or blood, as if every water has been brought up for this giving in, as if his body is already a river and rushing away. Now use your arms. It takes strength to steady the convulsing of a thing this young. And then, once his gaze rolls back to white, you know what to do. You know your job. Push together the furred slits of his lids, close the extinguished horizons of his eyes. Now, don't play stupid. You knew this was coming. You've seen it enough times. You're not dumb, just desperate to try to save this little meat goat the farmer dumped at your door, too septic and riddled with worms to even be killed to eat. Now, get on your knees. Mop it up. As you wring out the rags, don't push away what you know of the sun. Let yourself admit the light, how it made his ears pink and transparent, revealed the secret veins of leaves, how you adored it when they periscoped to your voice and he looked up to give you the small meditations of fresh milk and hay in his mouth. Go on. Get sentimental if you have to. Have a good cry. No one is here, and besides, who would care? Because you try, don't you? You always try, but always that impossible riddle, always the word riddled with the word worms, as if each whip-like body was curled into a question, a wriggling puzzle, a mob infestation of questions, parasites that love a home so hard they turned that kid goat anemic, fevering, stuttering with a murmuring heart, letting out a writhing pile of larvae and eggs. Little sips, little hooks, little burrows. This was how, little by little, that little goat finally collapsed, arched his throat back as if to be slit, jerked his legs up into the nothing, like the fetus he was just 2 months before. But here is the point. Do not ever let yourself think it didn't matter. It matters then as it matters now, because until this morning rose dull on the horizon with this useless, good-for-nothing goat now dead on your floor, regardless, in spite of, no matter, you fed a beast worthless, a real lost cause, not unlike this whole stubborn, beautiful, screwed-up planet about to seize and drown in its own melt. There really wasn't a thing you could do. But admit it, if you knew, if you really could say he would not have died last night but would certainly die tomorrow, you'd force yourself out of bed and do what it is you do. You'd count his pills, warm his formula over the stove, rake out his soiled pen, and with arms wide you'd bring him a fresh bale of hay. Yes, that's right. Now say his silly goat name, because yes, every living thing deserves a name. And you called him Peanut, a playful way to say he was a flake of the size he should have been. So sick he did not jump or play as he should, but leaned his tiny face exhausted into your leg. Now bend to stroke his scrawny goat neck. Say, "Good boy, Peanut. We've got you. Now there, everything's gonna be just fine. You know it's a lie, but no matter. This is your job. It's what you do. It's what needs to be done."
Nickole Brown, thank you for that story of Peanut. I would never have thought of calling a goat Peanut, and yet I like the idea of the little goat named Peanut. The piece you just did, this was written about Farm Sanctuary, the center where you work in Asheville.
So it's called Animal Haven. It's a farm sanctuary and they take unwanted, abused animals, farm animals they have.
So any animal out there feeling unwanted and abused can go down to Farm Sanctuary and hang around with all the other animals, right?
You might want to talk to Trina and Barb about that before we put out a PA. But yes, they do have their arms full, that's for sure. Very hard.
But it's always a good thing when people do that. I know that you appreciate it and the animals appreciate it. I love pigs, so when you talked about the pig being as big as the refrigerator, yes, I thought I'd love to go down and visit that pig. Does that pig happen to have a name?
We have Rudy and Junebug and JT and Lola, yes. So we have 4 right now, 3 of which are the Vietnamese potbelly pigs, which I think people adopt as pets thinking they're going to be little and cute forever, and they get absolutely huge. And then we have a micro pig, that's Rudy, and he's getting pretty big now too. So, and they root. They turn up the mud, and they like to play in the mud. And so unless you know what you're getting into, they can be difficult as pets. I think that people expect them to be dogs. They're as smart as dogs, if not smarter on some levels, but no.
So when you say big as a refrigerator, you're not joking?
No. No, I'm really not.
I remember when I would often go to Warren Wilson, and I would see pigs as big as refrigerators, and they indeed do love to play in the mud. Yeah. Speaking about playing in the mud, when you were young, you said you played often in your family's backyard, and you spoke with a heavy accent, and you brought up the idea of code switching. Yes. And I'd love to talk about that a bit, because when I was young, growing up here in Asheville, I had the same experience. I think mine came in the 7th and 8th grade when Mr. Ramsey, my 7th grade teacher, this was in 1959, stood in front of the class and said, without hesitation, he did not think men could ever land on the moon. This was in 1959. They had already launched a few rockets into space, and he was resisting dramatically the idea of the possibility of humanity arriving on another planet. And as I listened to Mr. Ramsey say that, I thought, that guy does not know what he's talking about. And I think that was when I also began to realize I needed to change my language if I wanted to go to the moon. So I was speaking in a much deeper accent than I do now. And over the years, I learned to change that because I traveled a lot. Sometimes you get pushback from it. People will say, oh, you changed your language, so you must be ashamed of where you came from. Can you reflect on code switching and upgrading one's sensibilities to follow the destiny of the rooftop poet at 15?
So it's a complicated question. I would say first, let me start and talk about the language from which I come. It's my mother tongue. It's the language of story for me. It's the language of comfort. It's also the accent that I slip into if I've had a drink or two or if I'm upset about something. And it is my primary language, and I love it for so many reasons of home and comfort. And let's be frank, it's just fun and it's funny, and the idioms are fantastic and the rhythms are beautiful. And my grandmother, who helped raise me, which is what my second book is about, that was how she spoke. And for a really long time when I was younger, I felt as if I had to completely abandon that language in order to be a poet, that I had to write in the register of Keats, and if not Keats, then Walt Whitman, and if not Walt Whitman, then Allen Ginsberg, and if not that, then who? And it took me a long time to realize that that wasn't necessarily true. What I had to learn how to do was to move between the two registers, so that I could present my grandmother's voice, so that I could present the language that I knew and spoke as a child in a way that avoided caricature, that avoided stereotype, that came across clearly to a reader no matter where they were from, but yet was still true to those rhythms and meanings that I knew when I was younger. And it took some getting used to. I first learned how to do it when I was writing Sister, or started to approach it, and then I got closer, and Fanny Says. And what's interesting, I think, even in the book I'm writing now about these animals, I'm still drawing on a lot of those same rhythms. I'm still drawing on a lot of those same languages, just a less direct way.
So what would be an example of speaking in your mother tongue? How about a poem from your sister or your grandmother that reflects the experience of language you had when you were younger? Sure.
So you can think of this code switching, I think, as straddling a fence, right? On one side you got one thing, and on another you got another. This is from Fanny Says, and it's called Your Monthly. And the title here, of course, is in reference to what my grandmother used to refer to menstruation. Your monthly is what her mama called it, but what I want is a word for the year she bled freely. A wad of old wash rags, each end pinned to a belt around her waist. A word for 12 happy deaths, each unfertilized cell that washed out, saying, "Not yet, Fanny, you still just a child yourself." Because this world knows a girl of 14's too old to be playing cowboys and Indians, but also knows how young she was when, stiff red feather in her hair, she scrambled inside, hollering, "Mama, come quick, I'm about to bleed to death." A word for the year she learned to walk in red shoes pulled from some rich lady's trash, the sound of those heels down the hall, 2 guns cocking with quick clicks, a sound to hide from her daddy in the morning, eating his breakfast of milk and corn pone with a spoon. A word for the time before a man swaggered in, bought her a dime store Coke, bought her her very first bra, then took her to the picture show to see a cartoon with dwarves impossibly happy to be working the mines. A year later, she was expecting. Though what exactly I was expecting, she told me, I couldn't have said. A word, please, somebody, give me, for that season with her uterus small and tight as an inedible green pear, her body keening and cramped in its stall. A word for all things not yet stretched to bits. A word for all things not yet broken. A word for all things left unbroken. A word for breakable yet unbroken things. A word for unbroken, expectant things. Tell me, what is that word?
And that's your grandmother, right?
That is me in conversation with my grandmother. So there are lines in there of her talking to me, telling me that story of when she was young, what her mama had to say to her. But it's also me looking for a language that doesn't exist, neither in the language of my childhood nor the language I have now. Tell me, what is that word? And I think that is what poets do. They're looking for words that don't exist.
And wouldn't they also be looking for combinations of words put together to make some sort of new sensibility?
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
What about teaching? Can one teach poetry?
I think here's what I can do. I can help people with their practice of awareness. I can show individuals interested in writing how important it is to write through the senses and what that looks like. I can talk about how a line can be broken and when a line breaks in a certain way, how it changes the poem. I can talk about form. I can talk about perseverance and tenacity and talk about how many rejections will be coming their way if they send their work out. But when I teach, I'm very much in the school of bell hooks, meaning teaching to transgress, meaning that when I am in front of the classroom, it's not me and my students under me. All I'm essentially doing as a teacher is working as a facilitator and a moderator so that the community of students can rise up and tend to and nurture each other and themselves. I'm there to help people generate and connect. That's what a teacher does, I think. And mostly when I'm not teaching, I'm reading as much as I can so that when I do have a class, I can show them all the cool stuff I found. Really. So that's how I think about teaching.
So those people in the listening audience, they're in different environments.
Yes.
Somebody might be in a studio working on their art. Someone's driving down Merriman Avenue. Someone's staring out the window, listening to us have a conversation. How would you encourage the people listening to become more aware of their environment, and how could they look at it poetically?
The first thing you have to think about is that we often think that poems come from the head. They come from the mind. That's not necessarily so. You need your brain. You need all those words in there. But I think that poems come from the body. I think that poems come from the senses. One of the great difficulties of the world in which it's arranged right now is that we're always staring into a screen. We have fooled ourselves into thinking that experience comes just through the eyes, and that we can live in that virtual way, and we have therefore abandoned our awareness. Some of this has to do with despair. Some of this has to do with the pressures of literally just surviving in the world that it is now. I mean, I know upstairs I have about 50 emails waiting for me. But we can't abandon the opportunity to be present. That's where poetry is. Poets are noticers. Our job is to notice things. Our job is to not turn away and to look, and not just look, but hear and smell and taste and touch and listen with everything we have, so that we can transmit that experience on the page. And in particular, transmit it in a way to make it strange, to make it new, to take those quotidian, everyday things that people see all the time and completely take for granted without looking anymore. Be it a tree or an apple or a chair or your mother or your spouse. Because these things are fleeting, they're going to leave us. We are going to leave them. And who noticed along the way? Those noticings where you pay attention, that's a poem. You have to write the kind of poems that you need to hear your own truth. I think sometimes this problem has more to do with a writer's self-confidence more than anything. They think that the simple thing that they have to say is not enough, that it won't do the job, and so they have to gild the lily, so to speak. And all it does is obscure and confuse and put off the reader, because what I think readers are looking for on the page is something authentic and real, and that has the courage to perhaps say that thing that nobody really wants to say, or that has the stamina to look really hard at that thing maybe nobody wants to take the time to look at. And so, no, poetry doesn't have to be beautiful. Poems can be good and ugly. You know, they can be gritty and real. And don't pull your thesaurus out all the time. Just say what it is that you need to say, and say it plain. And trust that it's there. If it dies on the page, it probably has a whole lot more to do with the fact that it's a cliche or an abstraction than it does with the fact that it's just simply not fancy enough. And Langston Hughes often wrote in just that plain-spoken, heartfelt way, and which is why he's still read today.
And there you go, my friends. Thus concludes my conversation with Nickole Brown. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you for tuning in to the Imaginative Storm podcast. I'm your host, James Nave. Please do join us any Saturday morning for our Imaginative Storm Writing Prompt of the Week session. It's always free on Zoom, 10 a.m. Mountain Time, noon Eastern Time. Thanks, Walter Parks, for our theme song. If you have any thoughts or questions, my email is nave@imaginativestorm.com. Nave spelled N-A-V-E. So once again, thanks for tuning in. We really do appreciate it, and we hope to catch you on that turnaround somewhere down the line.